Hello and welcome to the 18th of December and the next window on this, the TooFatLardies festive advent calendar for 2021. Why don't you pull up a chair, grab yourself a mince pie, ideally a glass of port or maybe brandy, and listen to Nick talking about the inspiration behind the phenomena which we know and love in the TooFatLardies rules, which relates to big men and sometimes occasionally to big women as well. And it's all about how that idea came into being. So Nick, take it away please. Looking forward to this one, sir.
When I think back to the war games we used to play in the 1980s and 90s, the one thing that they generally lacked was anything that captured any concept of personal leadership. It just didn't really appear as a factor in many of the rule sets. There were references that attempted to capture it, such as ranges for command for leaders, or the old favourite of adding +1 for attaching a general officer to the attack. I spoke on another of these advent calendars about personal stories, and Sid has also spoken about this in his inspirations, I know. And what I'm talking about today is how we capture those personal acts of intervention, that moment when the right man steps up and leads others. Very often he will also have rank. It is after all what gives him the training and position, but he doesn't have to have rank. It could be somebody who steps up and takes command and does something that moves the situation forward. I remember talking to a young officer in the British Army who took his men into action. He said, and I paraphrase a little bit, that while he was moving across country with his men, they came under fire. Of course, everyone went to ground. He said that as he sat there, scrunched up behind a piece of cover, listening to the sound of the oncoming fire, he became aware of a tapping on his foot. He looked round to see the face of one of his corporals who'd been tapping his boot with his hand. The corporal looked him in the eye and just said, "Sir, you're on." And that story has really struck with me because I can imagine it being typical of just about any small unit engagement throughout history. An action is initiated. The enemy open fire. And what happens next is crucially important. If that young lieutenant stays hunkered in cover, then his unit is paralysed. If he steps up, makes an appraisal of the situation and makes decisions, issues command to his section leaders, he gives himself the chance of wrestling back some of the initiative of the action. And that stepping up takes guts, as well as training and motivation. Of course, when that time comes, not every big man steps up. In our first rule set, IBSM, we made the decision that we would incorporate big men. These were most likely to be leaders, but as I say, don't have to be. Sometimes a relatively junior rank will step up and do something that shifts the balance of the action. We wanted to allow for that. We incorporated these big men in IBSM in a couple of ways. Firstly, when the big man is activated, he has a chance to activate the men around him. But, and this was a mechanism that really turned big men into those larger-than-life heroes, we also included a heroic leader card. This was a one-shot wonder that could be used for the leader to do something out of the ordinary. Thus, if the platoon was pinned down by an enemy tank, the platoon leader might use the card to grab the piet, run forward and take a shot at the enemy tank. The great thing about the card was that the players had to agree that the action was suitably heroic, which must have struck some players as totally absurd, but it did always triggered a very interesting discussion about how both players were interpreting the situation that they saw on the tabletop. And this drew the players, of course, even closer into the narrative. They would describe what's going on and say what they felt from that situation would be deemed a heroic action. Great to listen to, as an umpire really drew you into the action as well. The easiest way to further explain this is with a couple of examples that almost everyone will recognise. The thinking behind big men. So let's look at Band of Brothers, for instance. Band of Brothers, now curiously, Band of Brothers is also 20 years old this year. Great TV series. I'm sure many of the people listening to this podcast will have watched it. So 20 years old. It came out at the same time as we published IBSM, funnily enough. And it was incidentally also filmed about a mile from where I was living at the time. I remember listening to the gunfire coming from the other side of the town. But Band of Brothers is filled with examples of how big men influence the battlefield. In fact, the whole programme is really an exploration of it. Let's start then with the attack on Carentan in episode 3. So Easy Company are pushing into town when an enemy machine gun opens up on them. In IBSM terms, the Germans play their MG bonus card and open up with MG42s. The advancing US troops get hit, take shock and go to ground. What happens next really matters. It's a case of that "Sir, you're on" moment. In game terms, the next card out is the US big man. He uses his activation to get the guys up out of the ditch and keeps them moving. Without that intervention, the Germans would pin the advancing paratroopers and hold Carentan. But with that activation, at that time, the US player maintains his momentum and pushes home his attack. And doing it with big men cards or leader activations in Chain of Command or leader cards and flags in sharp practice does that in a way that adds to the storyline of the action, in a way that +1 for general just doesn't capture. So let's look at the next example, the collapsing attack on the village of Foy. So Easy Company are attacking down into the town and their attack is faltering. The leader is collapsing under the pressure of the advance, so Winters sends in Spears to take command. In our gaming terms, he allocates his best leader, a big man, to the point of the battle where his intervention makes the most difference. Spears famously gets in, takes charge, makes decisions, then runs right through the village and back to meet up with one of the other companies. It's a big man for a big job. It's inspirational, it's presented in an inspirational way, and it fits into the games that we play. So my third example is another paratrooper one, but it is a story that you probably won't have heard. Lieutenant Waverley Ray was the executive officer of D Company, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of 82nd Airborne. During the defence of St Mary Glees on D-Day, the German 105 8th Infantry Regiment was pushing hard into the northern outskirts of the town. The 505th, charged with the defence of the town, had a tough fight on their hands. Ray was a Mississippian, described as a heavy 250-pound man with a soft-faced Bible reader, and he didn't drink, didn't smoke, or didn't chase women. With the fight in the north of the town at its peak, the colonel pushes Ray, D Company, in to support a local counterattack. Ray acts as scout, and this is described in Phil Nordyke's excellent book, 4 Stars of Valour, the combat history of the 505th. So let me just read you from that. It says, Ray told people what they had to do. He collected all of the grenades he could carry from the company headquarters personnel. Then, armed with his M1 rifle, an Army 45 and a silver 38 revolver stuck in his jump boot, he went on a reconnaissance to better formulate his plan of attack. I'll jump forward a few lines. With utmost strength and courage, he moved up the sunken lanes, across the orchards, through the hedgerows and ditches sprinkled with German units moving forward for their next drive to take the town. He went north about 300 yards along the enemy left flank, then moved west a couple of 100 yards at right angles to the German axis of attack. Acting as a scout, Ray led 1st Platoon around the left flank of the 1st Battalion, 1058th Regiment, approaching it from the rear. Colonel Van der Voort described what happened next. Moving like the deer stalker he was, he went south along a ditch until he heard guttural voices on the other side of the hedgerow. Stepping up and looking over the earthen embankment, he saw 8 Germans in a sunken lane gathered round a radio. Covering them with his M1 rifle, he barked into his best command voice, "Handy hoch!" Most instinctively raised their hands, except one who tried to pull a P38 pistol from his holster on his belt. Ray shot the man instantly. At the same time, 2 Germans stood up in a slit trench about 100 yards to his left rear. With bursts from Schmeiser machine pistols, they tried to take his head off, dipping 2 9mm pieces out of his right ear. Momentarily disregarding the hail of bullets from behind, Ray shot the other 7 men in the lane, dead. Then whirling round, he jumped back into the ditch, loaded another 8-round clip into his M1 and dropped the other 2 Germans across the field with a shot apiece. The 8 dead Germans in the lane were the commanding officer and headquarters staff of the 1st Battalion, 1058th Grenadier Regiment. So, of course, from this action, Ray's reputation soars. By the time that September arrives, he's fighting at Nijmegen, this time with D Company pushing towards the railway bridge. The attack, however, has faltered. Again, Ray was informed that there was an enemy tank up near the bridge, so he gathered a bazooka team and a BAR team to go forward in an attempt to neutralise the tank. Again, the big man steps up. Ray leads the way. The commander's got the right men in the right situation, doing the right thing at the right time. As they go forward, they're met by heavy enemy fire, and the other men falter. But Ray pushes on for one more time, and is killed by enemy fire. Now I throw this last and sad aspect in because Ray's death had a profound effect on the men on the embankment. As he fell, so did their ability to push the position. Ray, their hero, the man who had done those great things in Normandy, had been slain. In game terms, the loss of their leader had a huge impact on their force morale. So when you think about all of that, all of those stories, you can see how Ray and the others, and the other many stories just like it, have influenced the games that we try to create. What we're trying to do in our games is create a narrative that could flow and read like any of those accounts. There is more to leadership than just giving a +1 for general.